Okay. Good evening. I don't know for sure how long past the timer I set. Just thinking about stuff and pulling things up. Yeah, it shows you where my head's at. Um, one of these days I will have a normal intro. But no, yeah, probably not. At this point, the asymmetry and stumbling into a room, spilling your coffee sort of intro is practically a trademark. Uh, yeah. As mentioned in the tweet, this is art ramble. This is kind of a just a chatting and art talk, and sometimes it gets a little bit essay-ish, and other times I'm just kind of winging it. I mean, not that I'm not almost always winging it, but it's just a chance to talk about art stuff, talk about story building stuff, world building stuff. Anything that kind of comes to mind. And I feel like the last few have all just been me, like, working through art related stuff, like trying to figure out, where I am, what kind of voice I'm trying to bring to the table. And it's a lot of stuff about like artists and their interaction with the world and their audiences, and like what kind of goes into that for at least me, and what seems to happen for other people as individuals. And I don't know. I've spent a lot of time working on that kind of stuff, and it's made it not harder, but like it's been distracting from trying to actively work on the kinds of projects and stuff that I'm trying to get to by doing all of that, internal work, I guess. And it seemed like, especially since I've been working on specific things, which I'll talk about a little bit, uh, that while my head was more in that space, it might be good to dive in, do a little bit more design and world building, and talking and stuff about some of the stuff that I've been working on. Might as well, you know. And maybe it'll be a little less of just me therapizing myself through stream or something this time. We'll find out. Uh, hey, King. Welcome to whatever this is about to be. And yeah, well, we'll get into some stuff. I pulled up some older designs, and I've been thinking a bit more about the design of this character that I have here, this sleep character, because I've been through a few iterations of this one already, and some of them uh, have stuck. Some of them are not perfectly designed. Like this one has a fair amount of motion and things like that, but it was very much from a desire to not be like sticking up from the bottom of the screen like a paper cutout or something. I wanted to be able to like free roam through the scene a little bit more, and like be able to like over here, over there, and kind of get like a little bit more of a full body thing, because I don't have a lot of expression in the face and such. And I've been thinking more about that as I try and come up with new designs and stuff. And some of what I'll talk about, what I wanted to talk about tonight, is kind of going into the world building of like where this character is kind of coming from, not just for the stream purposes, but because I found myself wanting to explore it further and writing it into a setting that I'm trying to create a series of short stories, and like an anthology with like an interwoven singular story. And I found myself writing Sleep, this character that I've created, into that space, because they both kind of came from the same roots. I wanted some weird underwatery sort of, you know, protoplasm sort of character that's, kind of formless, and just picks up things and takes on shells that it finds interesting for one reason or another. and kind of explores the dark, but like what the character separate from myself is interested in has been kind of evolving a little bit, and like how they would view the world separately, something like that. But I don't know. We'll find out what we get into there, because I'm gonna talk about it a little bit. I'm gonna hopefully draw some stuff and sketch some stuff. I'm a little cold, um, not physically, but like art wise, because had a rough couple mental days and just took some vegetable time. So gonna, per usual, seemingly after every weekend or break, I gotta get back on the art horse. But that's part of what it is about. Let's fix that. There we go. So I guess we can go over to the art side. It's always fun when I completely hide behind the tablet there, right? So yeah, I mean, obviously, I was working on this environment last week, and I found out at the end of the quiet stream, unfortunately, that I had been working on the wrong layer, and so a lot of the details are kind of painted in to the background colors, onto which I also need to lay different stuff out without affecting the line art. So I have a chunk of that to redo, and it's a little bit of a setback because I effectively have to paint out all of the details that I created and then try and recreate them on a separate layer, because any kind of shenanigans I try and do with these little tiny scratchy details in the inks, if I try and extract if I try to extract those with some sort of selection, I'm just gonna have just as much pixelated mess to sort of correct. So it's going to be easier to redo it. I think it's just the mental hurdle of, okay, I have to do this all over again. But yeah, this is one of the little underwater base sort of environments with like a moon pool situation that I thought of, and I thought this one would be cool because it has a bunch of screens and things like that where I can put different stuff for gaming, including having a version of the game or whatever on this the big screen in the background until it's time to actually play a game, and then I can bring that screen kind of into the foreground, kind of taking up most of the screen, you know, and yeah, it's a work in progress. It's going a little faster than my previous one, which I took months and months on for no reason at all, apart from just long gaps between working on it. But what I kind of wanted to talk about was like a little bit of character building and world building, because I've been trying to like piece together a little bit of this. I've been working in the background. I've done a bunch of pre-writing and outlining. I have, a grid of a, a sequence effectively of the entire like first installment or whatever you want to call it, of the Abyssal anthology. And there's a through line story that has a sort of character that is, you know, doing the standard thing. Event happens, they're trying to accomplish a goal, they have to go on this journey on their own. But along the way, like in between each of their story segments, my plan is to introduce other stories shorter ones that only have, you know, like one position in the narrative. And then after that, uh the lead character's next story touches that one in some way that makes it part of the same world. Um Sometimes in very small ways, sometimes in interactive ways, and sometimes as like background elements. So you realize that these things are all happening in the same place or on a similar timeline. Or, you know, in some cases there might be something that happened and we're effectively doing a flashback, and then that explains the situation that you're arriving in. And the one of the reason I wanted to do that for the written version of all of this is that in storytelling, um, especially in written storytelling, I feel like there is this element that has nothing to do with surprise or not knowing or being perfectly in the main character's perspective, that is, you know, kind of audience participation, audience being in on elements of the story that the characters are not, so that they can anticipate and feel that sort of anxiousness that those characters would not. And I think that draws out the tension in stories and like the attention of people in stories when they know a bit more than the characters, so they're not just following something mundane until the surprise, and then boom, that moment is the only like true engagement, and you end up like waiting for those moments without having anything sort of meaningful lead in, and it's like a game that's all jump scares, you know, narratively speaking. um and I'm not as much about those because I like the meta elements of writing and plot development and such. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about world building stuff behind it. We'll see how I feel about it. This is like 60% planned, and by 60%, I have 60% of an idea of what I wanted to talk about, in addition to um the sort of art and design topic of the evening. Expand my palette here a little bit. Okay, so uh wanted to talk about like a world building thing that is kind of like it's a little bit of a through line that from an idea that I had many years ago. Uh many many's ago. Where I kind of had this thought that I feel like was inspired by a few like little bits from movies and stuff like that. There was the movie House, which is kind of like campy and weird, but it had some striking visual elements, like him going through the bathroom mirror. Spoilers for like a movie from the 80s or 90s. Um, he had this sort of, he goes through this bathroom mirror and he's climbing down a rope into this infinite, seemingly infinite void, just pure blackness in all directions, hanging doorway above. You know, it's imagery that I feel like has come up many times. Um, the absence of the world being the eye catching element. Um, and yeah, let me scribble my little inspirations, perhaps. So yeah, you know, he had gone through this bathroom mirror, and there was a rope just hanging down into the dark. And as he kind of descended that rope, he was, attacked by some flying, stop motion monster, as was common, practice for the time. They didn't have a lot of CG stuff going on back then. And he fell off the rope down into this abyss, and then instead of just falling forever or splattering on something hard surface, he fell into water and then crawled out of like a lake or something, in a hallucination or manifestation of like his Vietnam War trauma. Um, but that space is one of the things that I remembered the most until I rewatched it as an adult. And a lot of the other stuff is hit or miss in that movie. Like I said, it's more funny than scary. But that space was something that stuck with me. And there was another one. It was called might have been like I feel like it was an old, like even older, like maybe late 70s, early 80s. Like a Lord of Darkness or something like that. I don't remember the exact title of it. What I do remember is that like most of the movie was kind of fuzzy and like didn't really stand out to me, especially because I was probably pretty young when I saw it, or at least young enough to like not have many memories stick. But in that one, they had this sort of another portal, interestingly enough, but it was a vertical surface, like a mirror, effectively. And yeah, it was like a vertical surface, like a mirror, but it was like a pitch black watery surface. And at one point, reaching through to the other side, it became clear that the other side was like water. And in some ways, I think that was just because of the effects that they were doing at the time. That was a cool way for them to create an alien feeling other side, was to, film, a creepy hand, going down through water and stuff like that, to create a surface by, tilting a camera, so that a pool of water looked vertical, and you know using that as the sort of portal space between realms. But like, it was one of the first times I had seen like something like that where it talked about it being liquid. And I think the last inspiration that really stuck with me for this whole thing, and you're maybe starting to see a through line of black spaces, otherworldly spaces, just completely, nothingness, but also water. Um, and that was it was oh lord, I don't know if I can even draw this one, but it was the gravity drive of all things from Event Horizon, which of course was spiked as hell for no apparent reason other than science. It had a bunch of rings and stuff moving, but inside there was this sort of space that when the gate opened, it was liquid, and one of the characters gets cut, like pulled through, and of course they come back cracked and do crazy things. But um, just that sort of surface, because I think a lot of portals and things like that in movies and cinema and things like that, people focus on light. So having stuff that was just like a void but also liquid was a fascinating sort of thing to me. And on top of that, you maybe have some real world elements in my mind where, deep dark water you can't see the bottom of. It's not quite thalassophobia because I'm not like afraid to go in the water, but there is a discomfort. There is a sort of discomfort that comes from a space so deep that it's hard to fathom how far away the bottom is. The same thing kind of happens to me with space. I'm made a little bit uncomfortable by the idea of an infinite void that you could just hurtle through forever. Um, and so, I combined all of those things, I think, and, in conjunction with, something I wrote as a one off for like a role playing thing with some friends, um, I created this sort of liquid dark space that is effectively the natural state of all matter when it is not currently, a physical thing. But also, thoughts and energy as well. It's like, my answer, I guess, to dark matter in a way. It's the deconstructed version of everything, the universal substance, etc. And it's kind of overlapping in a way. So we have, the material world, and you have, the state that's kind of behind it, which I just kept calling the liquid dark. It's kind of a cheesy ultra functional name. Call it whatever you will. I imagine lots of people would call it like limbo, or the space in between, or like there's a million names for a space that's not really a part of any material dimension, I guess. But and the places where it overlaps, have to do with certain key things. Like the spaces where they overlap are an absence is like if either side is missing these things, that's if the material world, excuse me, is missing certain elements, um that's where you get like an overlap where there's a transition space between them. And it's not like just like, oh, this is a hard portal, like, because it has to be uh no light, uh have water because it's closer to that natural state, and those two things effectively cause like an overlap. So it allows me to do dumb stuff like say, this is how we end up with sea monsters and things, because down in the bottom of the oceans or whatever, where the light doesn't reach, is a transition point, an invisible transition between the material world and like the blank slate, dark. Um, this stuff is, has a lot of interesting properties. I will say the material world is effectively finite in its own right, but that's with an asterisk. Uh, and it'll start in a minute. But the dark is the dark side of things is infinite, because it's the antimatter state. It's how everything forms and from what everything forms, and it's ether, dark matter, whatever you want to call it. Um, there are a few things that cause it to form matter. So it's kind of affected by light from material worlds. It causes this stuff to effectively uh, try and take on whatever solid form is necessary. So, effectively shining a light on a transition between the material world and this liquid dark space would just close the gate, close the doorway. Everything around you would become solid while it is lit, and that transition would disappear. Um, with any number of weird effects, depending on what's there, because it's also affected by will. Not just some dude named Will, or the legal document, but like the will of a conscious thing. The will of a conscious thing, um, once formed, can affect this substance and create things. It can create worlds, even, and uh, and that's why the whole finite thing of the material world is an asterisk, because this is an alternate conception of a multiverse where it's not, people's decisions and different versions of events that cause things to diverge on like timelines. It's literally different wills making different worlds, whether it be individuals, whether it be, some godlike consciousness, etc. And it's basically, you know whether or not those things are close together, whether or not they're close enough to reach each other, is how much alike they actually are. um but yeah, kind of strange. So something else worth noting is that there is spontaneous life there. And you wouldn't think, I mean, it's literally the universal substance, in the absence of interference, it should not create other things. But in addition to both physical and non-physical presence, it's also dealing with thought and mind and energy. Um, Akin in some ways, perhaps, to like the idea of a collective unconscious, in that every thought that has ever been had by anyone ever, kind of dissolves into this space and, um, coalesces around, the overlapping spaces, or the like, like I think at one point I made part of the theory that like the fact that you have your brain is effectively in a dark, sort of damp enclosure, uh gives you like an intrinsic connection to the stuff on the other side. uh and that, I think I when I first wrote it, I wrote it like some sort of madman in a notebook. And like one of the things that I wrote, it was like, yeah, it was like Rory's theory of everything or something. But I I think I wrote a line in there where I was talking about it could explain everything from like birth, like the way that people uh give birth, kind of being like this semi-aquatic state all the way up until the point of, exiting the womb, um to like reincarnation, when you die, that mind kind of dissolving in a way into all of its little component parts, all of your thoughts and experiences kind of slowly spreading out and mixing with everything else. But um when a new mind forms, like sometimes it's just, you know thought A colliding with thought B, and then those two things stuck together, um colliding with thought C, And then slowly you build up this cluster of thoughts that starts to form a mind. And so that's the reason there can be spontaneous life. And sometimes it's, formed around the will and interpretation of people and our understanding of, procreating and creating more people. Um, that starts, putting the thoughts out there that this kid is going to start developing a mind, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and and then once that will is there, like it's more difficult to affect that once it has a material connection. And sometimes that spontaneous life or whatever might occur in this space. And as a result, be kind of in the meta space of the universe. Like they have access to everything in a way, but also nothing. They have to like put stuff together. It's from the smallest possible pieces, unless they find points or they find threads of thought, lines of thinking that take them close to the material world. Because all things relative. So whether it be time, whether it be space, whether it be thought, etc., like all things are relative in the space. And so if two things like are close to each other in concept, they might be physically closer to each other or more likely to collide or be within reach of one another. So two similar outcomes of building worlds may have some shared things, and it won't necessarily be like copy of a copy of a copy where in one world this person has this job, in the other world everything's the same except they have a different job. It's not that close, but it does certain things, like the idea of if I'm building worlds with this as a sort of background theory, that effectively means that I can have reasons that stuff might unexpectedly line up, you know? Um One of the things that's always been kind of weird is that, like we have trouble imagining things beyond some combination of factors or elements that we have seen. So, a lot of scary monsters, they end up looking like things that scare us from the real world, like big nasty animals uh or basically, our fear of death personified as, you know, mummified corpse looking creatures that are like long and spindly and they have, sharp teeth and stuff. Um a lot of those things, you can easily trace back and see all the components. And it's just the combination that starts to feel unique. And that's a design problem too, like figuring out how to break things into such small parts that they're no longer as recognizable, um, as their origin, where the components originated from, uh, and then combining them in a unique enough way that people like, wow, I've never seen that before. which is a which is a good reason when you're doing using reference to not just use reference that's very specific to the subject matter that you're trying to do, but using reference for the ideas that you're trying to convey. So you can draw, like you're trying to draw a scary monster. You can draw from other monsters, you can draw from people, you can draw from animals and stuff like that. But it's when you start adding strange concepts or breaking the rules of all of those things, that it starts standing out as unique. You know, like giving it an unreasonable number of limbs and joints and things like that is one of the easiest ways to design, a monstrous thing. Um, Giving them no little or no form at all, and then just giving the surrounding that creature with ideas that convey its presence. Like some sort of invisible creature or energy thing. Like there's ways to do that, but yeah, like you can combine anything. Like you could grab a pony, a lawnmower, and the Ghost of Christmas Past or something. Like a bunch of seemingly unrelated things that if you deconstruct all the pieces and move them around enough, you collage together something new. Um, and I guess that's why I kind of like that as a sort of concept of the theory of the universe, because I feel like it gives room for everyone to have their own interpretation be true. Like if people want to have a religious belief about how the world was put together, it still fits in a way. Or if they want to have a scientific belief, they still that interpretation also works. And anything that is feels more mystical or dogmatic and stuff about it is just purely because it's affected by the will of those that perceive it. Um, Creating things that they both want and don't want. And once those things have will of their own, they start affecting the pattern as well. So it's not like you can necessarily, like, if you create something that has a will of its own, it is now completely separate. You can't control it anymore because it is altering its own trajectory. And that even like makes sense of the free will portions of certain religious elements, like if you want to go that direction. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It just felt like something that, like a substrate that would make room for everything and nothing, and was not designed to specifically disprove or go against any one of those things, even if it, defies the logic of all explanations of the universe in some way. But and I think I even had originally idea a sort of ebb and flow. Like the reason the universe, the material world that we know is expanding is because more of this is flowing into it and creating more of it. But it's still just an enormous bubble. And that also paved the way for a thought that one day that bubble could pop, and that all of the material stuff would kind of get flooded, and and the parts that would hold together would be like these islands of existence driven by the wills and perceptions of those people still on it, but very much islands of material kind of in the dark, with the barriers kind of being just the edge of someone's perception. And probably drawing from some thoughts that I have from like game dev and stuff like that, where you have things like where you are looking, objects exist, but you might have all these other points outside of your field of view that are waiting to exist once you perceive them and not before. Uh, and so as long as you keep moving forward, the train keeps generating in front of you. the world continues as you somewhat expect or as the general expectation sets. But behind you, it's also being erased. And if you turn around to go back, it might be different. And I love that concept and that execution in games. And I thought it would be fascinating, like if the idea of a place was all that was holding it all together, and the more certain parts of it are forgotten, or you know like because there's no bubble anymore, there's no barrier between the two, where light is being cast in all directions, and you know kind of closing the gaps, that stuff could spontaneously exist, and interact with and collide with us, and then also without that barrier between us, those who are exposed more directly to the water and stuff might be inspired by ideas from the outside, kind of being exposed to the cosmic soup and kind of being only, like a dive suit or a habitat wall away from that sort of infinite sea of possibility, means that creatures with like us, like humans with imaginations, are going to be creating a new world without realizing it. Um, which I maybe is a bit of a spoiler, but I'm also the type of person that believes if the only thing that makes a story good is the surprise at the end, you've already failed. Um, because if it does not compel you without that, why would you read the rest and not just go straight to the surprise? Especially when the surprise doesn't feel like it's fair. You know, there's nothing that annoys me more when there's like a plot twist inserted to like artificially drum up excitement, when it would have been far more satisfying to have one that was meant to be there, you know? Um and don't get me wrong, I enjoy some good plot twists and stuff now and then. But when it's just so meta bullshit, like that literally it breaks the canon of the story that you're in, just for the surprise factor, like it takes me out of it. It takes me out of the story when they're like, huh, surprise, this character does a 180 for no apparent reason other than we wanted there to be a twist. Like I don't like that kind of stuff as much. If people enjoy that kind of stuff and they're all about the surprise and not wanting any spoilers, and they can't not think about those things and still enjoy the story, like I get it. Not everyone is going to have the same experience, but I tend to be someone who leans more in the other direction. I'm more enticed by seeing how it all comes together than being surprised by a few of the pieces. Um, like I love spreading out things so that it's not a surprise, but it's not necessarily a surprise, but the culmination of all of the elements is satisfying as like seeing a puzzle come together. So I feel like there's a connection you can have with an audience when you're writing or creating a game or creating any narrative driven sort of storytelling element, where they can be in on it with you, and because they will never, fully inhabit the characters you're creating without bringing their own biases, it's also a way to kind of maintain just that little bit of narrative dissonant distance from the characters, so that you're not necessarily putting the reader in the position of the protagonist. They're over their shoulder. The difference between like not even first or third person perspective, but just for example, like seeing the world from a character's point of view or seeing it from the reader's point of view. And I always thought the reader's point of view was more interesting, the more meta view of things, because you can still get a picture of all of those feelings and thoughts and experiences that a character is having, but you don't necessarily have to think of it as you going through it. You can think of another character going through it. I think that's more, for me at least. Like I said, this is not a definitive statement of what is the best type of fiction. But for me at least, it always felt more interesting to experience events both through my point of view as the reader and also through the point of view of the character with that degree of separation. And it does make it challenging sometimes because I did a lot of writing when I was younger, as part of like, online role playing groups and stuff, playing, stuff like World of Darkness, which is all edgy vampires and werewolves and stuff, and through like some D&D games and things like that I got to do when I was younger. And then, as I got a bit older, uh, it was basically just cooperative storytelling with me and anybody that I had included in the stories. And um, there's definitely a difference, I think, between telling the story and being immersed in it as like a player, as a single character actor in that story. And I like that stuff. I really like role playing games for that because I feel like it can be this amazing exercise in empathy and like understanding yourself and understanding others and understanding and creating motivations for characters that you might not share yourself, and seeing where your mind takes that thread once you've got a handle on it, because I feel like that is the root of empathy, is not just understanding that other people feel different feelings from you, but like how those feelings work, what those thoughts lead to, putting yourself in someone else's mind, not just someone else's position as yourself, which are two very different things. Walking a mile in someone's shoes just means you're wearing shoes that probably don't fit you, and you're gonna feel however you feel about it. Walking a mile, walking a mile as someone else with their point of view, that's way harder. It's almost borderline impossible, but it gets you much closer to understanding who that person is or what that character is about. If you look at their motivations or their thoughts or things that they say or that they do objectively and say, okay, how did you get there? And, following that back far enough to like get a grasp of like what motivates that character, uh it's just one of those things that I feel like is good for acting and writing and creating things, but is also infinitely valuable in like reacting to other people in the real world with a degree of maybe delayed judgment. Where you find yourself looking to empathize or understand um earlier in the process, maybe even before you have an emotional reaction to it, although emotions are like they're even more relative than light in the whole grand equation of the cosmos. Emotions happen faster than you can like really comprehend. They just crash in uh instantly. A drop of food coloring in the water, boom, the whole thing has changed. Your emotions trigger so quickly that it's hard to like stall them and wait for a minute and think about things. And so it's usually, emotionally react, then start thinking about it, then come to a real conclusion, and then have the more final version of your emotions on the subject. And that's if it's a simple thing. If it's a complicated thing, you might go in that circle many times over. But I don't know. That's the kind of all of this madness, whatever you want to call it, is the substrate of you know sort of universe that I was touching with in Abyssal, and I'll admit, not to tangent too much more into personal stuff that I always do. Um, I've been struggling a little bit because there's a central character that I'm following, and there are elements of the character that I fully understand and that I've borrowed from myself or other people or any myriad of experiences to build this character. That is kind of there throughout many stages of the story. Um, so it's effectively main story, side story, main, and then it repeats. And there's a narrative arc that I'm trying to create there, where I'm trying to establish the world in the first story, build on it with the secondary outside story, and then take a few layers from that and carry the ball forward. um so it's got this alternating structure, and both the reader separately from the main character, um the reader and the main character are separately getting more information about this world, and they are experiencing it differently, because the the reader gets to experience the secondary story in its entirety through the perspectives of other characters. They get to be there for the experience, and the main character that's coming up and coming in after the fact, usually after the events of this story. So it is a linear timeline. Um, so this is always in a sequence. So each of these side stories, these anthology style stories, are taking place um, in parallel to the previous main story, or sometime before the two of them interact. And that secondary story is going to bring with it some expectations from the reader, because they've just freshly experienced this story, but the main character that's arriving in the next few scenes after that story is over, they're coming into the aftermath of it, or they're coming into the periphery of it while it's happening and seeing it from a distance. And so I wanted to give it that feeling of, a sort of interconnectedness. And as we connect all these dots, as with my thought process for like exploring the abyss or whatever, as in the stream side of things, um I kind of wanted to make all those connections and connect and weave together this world from those experiences, while giving the reader additional context, um, that maybe makes them understand parts of it better, maybe gives them more questions in many ways. And sometimes there will probably, I imagine there's probably a little bit of bait and switch that, feels like it's going to happen in that story. Because sometimes the influence on the main storyline might be larger. It might be a significant interaction with characters from that story, or with the location, or with the monster or creature, or outcomes, of that side story having an effect on the main story. Um, or they might just be things witnessed at a distance, and you realize, oh, the main character is near event A. They are near that disaster. And if they go that way, they may meet the same disastrous end. or you have no idea what might happen if they go in the direction of that thing that you know did not end well. And so you can create those moments of tension, but I don't want every one of them to be like, I saw a light over there, and you know, like, oh, that must be the light from blah blah blah, you know, and it's not always that simple. But I also like the idea of threading those things in, and if the character walks away from them because he's on a mission and he doesn't have time for just wandering around on the ocean floor, um, I want it to add to the a little bit of that feeling of tension where you realize he is fully in this world where these things are happening, and often he is within eye line of them, if not directly walking into or through them. Um, so the connectedness is not as loose as it might appear in some cases, but it does create the tension of like, okay, now I'm getting a bigger picture. You know, like first I understood that this threat was a possibility. Now, as a reader, I understand that this threat is a possibility, and and this one, but maybe this guy right here, the main character, he might only know about this one or this one and have no idea he's at risk for the others. And so he can make decisions based on that lack of information that are going to, you know, ramp up the anxiety for the reader if they care about this character. You know, like, oh, he doesn't know. And then suddenly there's this a building of tension, excitement, and interest and focus, trying to zero in on exactly what it is um, that is going to happen. Like, how is this character going to react to something that I already know about? You know? Let me check something here. Man, this thing is really out of sync. I can't quite tell when ads are playing and when they're not. So obnoxious. Anyways, either that or I just found a random exploit. We'll figure it out later. Um, yeah, I'm gonna take like 2 minutes, take a couple minutes, and stretch and everything, and I'll be right back. Okay. I officially rambled already enough that I feel like I did not hit when I was looking for the stream. Maybe it was because I feel like sometimes the more complicated design stuff, like I have to be able to focus for it and not be trying to state it out loud. Just letting certain stuff flow a little bit more so that I can crank out artwork. It's yeah, designing and creating artwork is, unless it's you've done hundreds or thousands of it, hundreds or thousands of copies of, sorry, not copies, sketches and things like that, that it's a part of your brain that can run autonomously. I feel like it can be challenging sometimes to both try and come up with a complex stream of thought and also uh, draw and concept something, because it's more than just relaying the concept that you're talking about. You're also trying to make additional decisions on top of that. So like this sort of blackboard sort of situation that I've got going on here is a little bit easier to do, but it is not. It's also not high art form. I'm not creating super elaborate illustrations and going into making all the little decisions that are required to create like I said, an illustration or a new concept or design. But one of the problems I've been having since I started working on the abyssal stuff more directly, and I've concepted stuff off and on several times and walked away from it and come back to it and been stressed out by it and put it down, and we've had all the conversations about that I feel like having. But a new development that I find interesting is that I'm trying to create this main character that is somewhat relatable, but I'm not trying to make him the everyman, everyman generic cardboard cutout good guy sort of person. Um, like I'm trying to make him a realistic person and such. And as such, I think sometimes he's not as interesting to me personally as a character. Whereas the character of Sleep, this sort of entity that has emerged from nothingness, is kind of adjacent enough to, you know, is adjacent enough to this abyssal world that I've been doing, that I when I was doing the new outline towards the final third of this narrative arc, this um anthology slash interwoven story that'll effectively be a whole book when it's done. um I was more interested in developing that character because it is so different to explore, and maybe that's just me trying to stave off the parts of the work that I'm just not as thrilled by. There's always a little bit that I feel like like doing the research and doing the things that make it feel real, and then figuring out how to bend those back again. Like I think I stress myself out about those things and doing them well, and so it takes a little bit of the fun out of the process. Even though I do enjoy the process, I don't enjoy the stress. So like my brain tries to slide over and be like, hey, look at this character over here. This is a weird character, huh? You want to explore that? You want to maybe draw some stuff? You want to expand that a little bit more? And like in some ways and places, like I can see how that part of my brain always wants to make these really bizarre and strange characters, but feels like I can't put them at the center of the narrative. And it's, like, it's not something I necessarily want to rewrite at the moment. I feel like it still works in where it's placed. It's a perfectly placed element. But that doesn't mean that my brain doesn't want to go off on a tangent, that kind of explores the strange and uh difficult to comprehend life and times of, this sleep entity that chose its own name for specific reasons related to how it perceived people when it, first came into contact with them, and, being connected to this substrate of the universe, kind of having an idea of, like how the not just the matter is weaving together, but how all of the thoughts and such are weaving together and making those distances relative and sometimes vast. And uh, it's been super strange. And it got me thinking about, like some of the stuff that I've walked away from a little bit, because when I started doing it, I didn't know exactly what to do. And so, I have this thing that I did is like a merch idea, even though it's not very good design for something like that. But just this idea of, starting here as almost nothing, a collection of thoughts coalescing in the abyss that amount to little more than I am, and then continuing to add answers to that question. Um, and then, eventually asking new questions, and, touching material space and finding objects and things that, have interest, a handful of bones in a strange, inhuman skull found in like a pocket of materialness amidst the black. And you have the first inclinations of a character or thing that is starting to have an identity. And then uh this kind of slime like creature that's effectively just thick water almost, by any other means. It's, this liquid darkness that, is held into a form like a very malleable single celled organism almost. It doesn't can't be like popped or deflated like a bubble, but there is a distinctive separation between it and its surrounding environment, and that's like the first elements of, identifying and separating itself. And then encountering, the sort of storyline of abyssal, in which the surface is gone and people are down in the abyssal zone, in this case the Atlantic, for lack of a better idea. There's some cool geographic features and things like that about the abyssal plains and things like that, off of the Atlantic continental shelf. The Pacific is just so huge that it doesn't have the same kind of interesting topology to play with. Like, as far as like trying to build interest, and not just having everything be infinite blackness and, a flat sandy beach at the bottom of the ocean. Like adding a bit of interest and some real world elements to it to suspend that disbelief a little bit of being disconnected from the rest of the universe. Um, a chunk of seafloor or whatever being adrift because, uh, you know, the bubble has burst and the material plane is now fractured and dissolving into its component parts, stuff like that. Um, so yeah, this is, the point where I kind of like somewhere between these two, which technically I created these two in the opposite order. Um, and maybe these two are also interchangeable. Because having that identity, but also choosing to use some of the left behind materials and technologies and stuff from humankind gives it a human adjacent feeling. Gives sleep that sort of outside observer, like trying to be agreeable to local populace, but not really pulling it off entirely. And there's this other version in my head that makes more sense in some ways because this evolution here was one of the first, like, an interpretation of one of the first sketches I did trying to come up with an idea of what sleep would be like. It was more than a year ago, like before October of last year, like when I started designing this skull and jelly based uh character. Because before that I just had like a generic sort of eel wearing a shirt and tie for no reason, with the white on black aesthetic that I had been creating. And it was basically just a talking head for me, because I wanted a presence on screen, but I have no desire to be on camera. And so I just did that PNG, and then I started designing what would later become Sleep. Sorry, taking a drink. Um, but this lovingly dubbed Carrion Chimera, a bunch of disparate creature parts kind of seamlessly blended in places, between that cell-like substance, the bones roughly in the right places but not quite, forming a skeletal structure, a sort of unnecessary mimicry in a way, uh but also a sort of form and format with the skate like uh tail and such that would allow it to traverse a liquid environment either extra dimensionally or like in the overlap where it's actually in the Atlantic, um kind of seamlessly. And that's one of the things that's been like a theme throughout. It's like if you want to travel worlds, you got to swim fast, sort of thing. uh and so I've been through a lot of different versions. Recently I did, stuff like this one, a little kind of chibi sort of version based on the emotes that I designed, which are just like a little gumdrop blob, uh with a few, with just the eyes and bits, the two little bones, no skull, to kind of be a more cartoonish stand-in, for my sleep character when I decide I want one. It does sometimes feel a little bit generic to me, and I'm working on ways to make it feel less so. But one of the original, like, this is one of the original sketches that I had, and the line art for that skull is actually something that I've exported and brought over into a lot of different versions of, including this V2 brig that I have right now. The original line art right here, practically untouched, is in this skull, Uh, I've redone the flats and the colors a few times, things like that to make it a little bit cleaner. I haven't scraped or cleaned too much of the lines though. Like the original sketchiness of it is kind of still there, which I think is cool. Um, but yeah, this was one of the first sketches, and you can even see where I described that there's like middle layers and stuff in here to make it look more like the skull is suspended in some sort of uh thicker, like, I don't know, what do you want to call it, ooze or plasma or whatever. And the fact that I didn't want to make it inky black, that I wanted to make it transparent, but like in, like a sort of dark black or gray sort of way, has been an infinite pain in my ass. But I feel like it makes a degree of sense to me that it would be something that would be almost completely transparent in the environment in which it was settled, except for the pieces that it carries along or the shells that it inhabits, and then that shell, serves its purpose. Like this drone is a quick way to get around because it can, make the systems function from the inside and, float around and maneuver at least reasonably, but is not necessarily some sort of ideal rapid movement sort of form. And then I think it was around October when I was doing my first sketches and doing my first versions of this. So I made this version, and I don't remember, I think this came after the October suit. So last year in October, or leading up to October, uh, maybe during October, I don't remember anymore. The timeline's messy. I'd have to go look. I designed this thing where it was just, like hands and stuff reaching out of the dark. I didn't really have a solid concept, I think, of what I wanted the thing to be like. This is like before sleep, but designed the suit and, put what details I could think to put on it. I spent a weird amount of time on this suit to almost immediately not want to use it after I started building a rig, but I think it was because the suit was so carefully laid out and in so many pieces that I didn't know how to, turn it into a rig. I could probably go back and do it now, but it would require a lot of work. Yeah, this was just my interesting Halloween rig, but the version that I went to after that was this dive suit, right? And it was still a PNG tube thing at the time, but sorry, um, it's warm in here. I need to open this room up now that I think it's close down to the stream. But yeah, it's getting warm in here. So I created this version of suit, and I put the air bubbles and things in there to kind of give it more of the impression of three-dimensional space, like making some of them more faded, having stuff that feels like it's more in the foreground, having these multiple layers that give like a thickness and shadow to everything. Like you can even see through to the back of the suit where the suit's not finished back there. And at this point in time, I wasn't using any symmetry tools, so the whole suit is kind of yeah, you can see there the relative proportions. So like I wanted to make the skull very clearly not human. But, like everything's kind of like skewed and crooked. It was very early on, and me rediscovering art that I did all of this, so I'm still surprised that it turned out as well as it did, and I'm curious what happens when I go back and I try and do some of these things again. There are definitely some design decisions that I like and that I would like to reuse. Um, but I've been trying to think, like what does the next iteration look like? And I got to this drone version that we have here, which I'm not going to open a piece of art for that, but so we've got this drone, and I just use the same skull, and I do like that there's movement. Sorry, I'm gonna move this over here so I can see what I'm doing. I do like that there's movement. I shifted things around based on my head position. So if I look up, it does this, and the skull rises independently. If I look down, the arms and stuff change position, and the skull kind of overlaps with the bones and stuff inside. Um, if I tilt my head to the right, it does the little arm motion. Same here. So if I look left or if I look right, it does this little. It looks like he's doing a little jogging animation. So there's a bunch of stuff that's like solid about it, but um, part of the problem is that the design is very flat, and when I tried to expand it into 3 dimensions, a lot of it did not make sense uh, in the way that I've laid it out here. And it's been hard to reconcile that. As I've been trying to figure all this stuff out, uh, it's worth noting here that this sort of weird dome shape doesn't make sense where it's positioned. It should be way further forward. Um, Actually, but yeah, I just did this like on the fly real quick, and this version of the suit became a much more simplified version of the suit based on the drone. And I've been trying to figure out since like how to hold on. We're just gonna do it the quick and dirty way. So I've been trying to figure out in the time since then, like how I can make this design fully 3 dimensional. I've created more of this like toaster sort of situation. But I'm gonna have to do some stuff to it. Like I need to make a bit of this make sense. Like bringing this dome forward. And figuring out how to connect all of this stuff, make a degree of sense out of it. I could probably even sync this even further back, honestly. So sync that further back, but also cover up more of it, things like that. So like figuring out how to make this thing three-dimensional was one of the reasons that I got kind of stuck for a while, because I did try and work on 3D modeling this thing and having it be a little bit more, like, I don't know, it almost has like the form factor of an old cathode ray television. uh, but also recognizing the skull in 3 dimensions. Um, but one of the reasons I wanted to do that is I wanted to try and create 3D models, and I wanted to try and create 3D environments, and in the long term have a version of this, VTube avatar be a 3 dimensional thing in Unreal, because that was one of the cooler things that I saw anybody do with VTubing, was make a sort of 3 dimensional platform and stuff like that to like wander around in. And the closest thing I could get to, like, I could think of to kind of creating an interactive game through the means of the stream, because I just thought that would be kind of, interesting. Sorry. Stream hiccup. But yeah, so like, and I thought at one point I was like, okay, I know I want to do 3D stuff at some point, right? I know I want to do some 3D stuff. Uh, it's like one of those long-term driving goals that I've been like waiting on for a long time. And but, in the short term it would be cool to design and do a next level 2D rig. Uh so like trying to potentially take this evolution and turn it into something. But when I was looking at it, like, there were a lot of things I didn't like about it because it was a very early sketch. My perspective is kind of wonky. There's lots of things about it I do and don't like, that I would like to try and figure out. Like, I like the idea of like this jellyfish bowl being the sort of containing element. There was a really cool illustration by somebody whose name I cannot remember at the moment, of like a skull within a jellyfish, and it just stuck with me. And has probably been part of the inspiration for a lot of this. But I like elements of that, but I also, part of me twitches a little bit at like it being so directly a derivative of the thing that inspired me. Granted, it's not the same type of skull, it's not the same type of transparency or art style or anything, but just I still kind of thought the idea was cool, and figuring out how to do it differently and how to bring enough of myself to it that it didn't feel like I was just being derivative has been a challenge. I liked this strange sort of S curve posture because it is a little bit more, shoulders forward, T-Rexing arms, with only a handful of bones in each to kind of represent the shapes. And then just this kind of cluster of different fins and like a stinger thing and like sets of toothy jaws that don't necessarily make sense or have to, because they're all just, chimeric elements, like someone wearing a suit of various sea creatures that have kind of been blended and mutated together, the thing style, kind of melted all together. The concept of the carrion rather than the actual, you know, bones and stuff. Like a replica of all of these dead things that it's seen on the bottom, on the abyssal plane, all of the the carcasses and stuff that drift down, marine snow, etc. Taking all of those bits and pieces, interpreting and saying, hey, I'll use that like this, and kind of just wearing it, being this pieced together organism that designs itself as it goes. Which some parts I find to be interesting, but other parts I find to be very frustrating. Um, so when I tried to think about it, like I got the urge to be like, you know what, I want to devise another 2D VTube rig that's more complicated than this one that I have here. Um, that has a full body so that I can, do some more stuff with it. Um, and try and make it feel more three-dimensional, because I really like, because it was my first rig, I made this one operate almost exclusively in 2 dimensions. Pieces slide around and rotate, but they don't morph, they don't flow or change, because a lot of them are very mechanical and it would be very difficult to do that in a way that feels smooth. If you create an organic shape and you warp and move it around a little bit so that you can show a morph as if something's turning a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, it does not look as natural when it is a mechanical form, when it is not a natural rounded or complex line. You immediately have a clearer idea of like the dimensions of like a suit like this, or a square box like thing. So it becomes more complicated to try and create those morphs between those two positions. And there's lots of ways that I've seen lots of YouTube rig designers kind of get around that, I think. I don't know if there's too many that have a lot of, those sorts of elements that they don't employ some sort of trick or, workaround to kind of not have the three-dimensional forms be as complicated as they would be to rotate in space. Because I think what is it, the animators who did like the Gundams and stuff, like, are famous for like maintaining the proportions and like the solid drawings of highly mechanical suits and stuff. But these days, a lot of those challenges are handled with 3D, which is kind of why I wanted to get into 3D a little bit. Um, because I want to cut the curve on those challenges a little bit. Um, I want to put things in motion. I want to tell stories in motion, not just write them. And so I've been trying to work my way into that, but as someone who struggles with concepts of practice for practice sake, I can't stop thinking about, like why I'm doing it and how much more I have to wait. I get impatient, I guess. Eventually, I'm sure I'm just going to get ground down and I'll have done enough practice by accident to have actually accomplished the goal, but it'll take longer that way, probably. He says with absolute confidence. But I wanted to explore this organic form a little bit more, and I guess in the last little bits of the stream, I wanted to show you a sort of concept sketch that I did of, putting a bunch of these things together, creating a more complex rig, trying to create that that form. But I think one of the problems that I kind of have with this one is that the silhouette feels weird. Um, there's different parts of it that I don't. I get I get that I went like in a slightly different direction, tried to make it longer and more angular, but at the same time I kept certain proportions too direct in trying to make more detail. Um, so let me just cut this thing out real quick because I want to. I want to dissect it a little bit. I want to talk about some stuff that I feel like I want to design differently and why I spent so much time making this like meticulous design with all these anatomical bones and things like that, only to immediately not feel it, um, especially when it like it was giving a little bit of that sort of be not afraid biblical angel nonsense, like with the pose, the A pose and stuff, but also because like it felt it doesn't feel quite the same. And I've been trying to figure out exactly what it is about it that I'm not fond of, like what I do like and what I don't, and like how these different forms make sense to me. And I think some of it is just not. I made it like a weird mermaid, but like in a way that I didn't enjoy, that I didn't feel like connected to. Like it's got some cool shapes and lines and things like that, but ultimately I just stuck a bunch of like bones and uh creature anatomy and stuff together, from sea creatures and like a vampire bat skull. I just copied a lot of real world anatomical skeletal features, right down to all the little bones in the hands and stuff like that. I really got like anatomical with it, and then it felt a little bit too much like an organism, if that makes sense. It felt a little bit too much like someone had designed it, and it stuck those pieces together. It wasn't, it feels very stiff in a way, and I've been trying to figure out how to make changes to that I actually how to make changes to that I actually want to kind of employ. Especially when I changed the silhouette of the skull, I think that was a big change, from the wide skull to the narrow, more uh, more familiar, more human looking, or not human, animal looking skull. Even though I like the big bone like teeth and stuff, I've got a big love of like this one prehistoric fish, the Dunkleocetus or something like that, where it has a skull on the outside of its skull, the the teeth being kind of directly attached to that. Just these big bone swords almost. These big bone teeth, connected to a skull on the outside of an armored head. But I like the profile of that, and I was surprised to find that like vampire bats have something kind of like that in this sort of skull. But I don't know, something about this, like I just didn't connect with it, even though I felt like it was looking technically good when I zoomed out. I didn't like it that much, and I've been trying to figure out what it is. And I feel like there's a few things. Uh, like I feel like part of me wants to always have the skull or whatever be a little bit more prominent and out of proportion, having it feel like it's from something that's much larger. Um, that's just one of those elements that I find to be interesting. Uh, I put human arms on it to represent that it had found some like human remains, but something about that I didn't like either. It felt too out of place, and maybe it was just because there was only you know one set, and that's something I've toyed with, is having having more than one set maybe. Because I do have that. There's a degree of fascination with multi-limb creatures and just understanding, the alien nature of that and exactly how it would change how those creatures function. And also in a way like I'm kind of avoiding things like I'm probably spending a little bit too much time avoiding things like just a whole bunch of tentacles and stuff flailing around because I feel like that's the most common interpretation of any undersea monstrosity is just make it 30% more octopus, and I wanted to do something that felt a little bit different. Um in messing around with this design, I'm like trying to think how else can I keep wanting to make it bigger or more grand in a way that would make it difficult to use as a rig, if it makes sense. Because part of me wants to take all of this to an extreme, uh, and just keep making it bigger in scale until it becomes unreasonable. Like, for example, making it a bit more what am I trying to say? Make it kind of like a bit more serpentine and like strangely repetitive in that way. Like, doing a bit of this. I'm just kind of connecting the different segments. Kind of breaking up that traditional sort of mermaid silhouette sort of problem that I develop. And I could even take some of these. That's that one. And do a bit of this number. I have chopped this thing up in a bad way. Okay, there we go. Yeah, give it like a bit of a tapered stepping up. Kind of give it something that's a bit more interesting, but then the proportions of the upper body start feeling strange or pointless. Like one of the things that I don't know how to feel is sort of this very pinned in upper body. Like if I make that larger and more proportionate, it starts feeling a little bit better. I take the skull again, a bit larger, but there is a problem like with this particular skull is that it is kind of narrow, and if I use the jellyfish kind of thing, it looks a bit yeah, I don't know. I have weird feelings about how that looks. Um but also the arms and stuff don't feel right. They don't feel strange enough. They don't feel large enough. They feel kind of stumpy now with everything else. So you end up with the problem of, scaling up the arms. And, trying to make less of a mess of them. This would be so much easier if I already had a puppet of this, but I don't. This is just me trying to, take it apart and say, hey, I can still do stuff with this. I can save as much as I want or don't want to. This is not a design I just have to abandon because it didn't work out the way I wanted the first time. But I also feel like there's room for more on top of this as well. Like the thing that keeps popping into my head is having some sort of array here, or having different bones and stuff that kind of stick out at strange angles. Um, but that definitely gives it like I'm trying to be not afraid somebody, and I'm not necessarily steering away for them from that for any particular reason. I just don't want people to make the immediate jump to religious, iconography. Um, but there's also been other versions that have like kind of occurred to me, and I feel like I'm somewhat inspired by an artist that I follow on Twitter. What is his name? He's done lots of concepting and stuff for projects and things like that. He's professional grade artist and whatnot. Where's his stuff? Hold on, because I was looking at some stuff earlier. It's a Darren Bartley apparently. Um, is a designer, which makes perfect sense. Um, why I would be drawn to that when I'm having design problems. But he does a bunch of stuff that is very clearly, like a more veteran design process where it'll be something a bit more. And forgive me, I don't have my pure ref up. Let me fix that real quick. So he'll have stuff like this, right? Where you can very clearly see it's small, it's silhouetted, just quick inks with sharp lines, and then trying to examine some variants on form and silhouette and like the different forms of mobility. Um, there's a bunch of design stuff from that same series that I really like, that are kind of inspiring to me to like examine different versions of stuff before I settle on one. Because I very commonly have a problem, like I don't do as much stuff like this where I'm like, I'm going to draw 5 different versions of this. I'm going to be like, take different inspiration each time as to how it mechanically should work or how it visually should work. I don't do that often enough. I end up doing that like when I do my next iteration, as opposed to in the process of designing one good one. Uh, this is another good example of like a whole bunch of different versions. Uh, a whole bunch of different versions and explorations of a similar profile, but like with different shapes and forms, different inspirations very clearly. Um, like all of these different silhouettes. You've got like the tentacle monstery version, you've got curved antlers, you've got stuff that looks more traditional, stuff that's more like warthogs. It's exaggeration and pushing and pulling a variety of features. There's one for hands, one with a bunch of hands that he did that I really liked actually. Um, these are from like his canceled projects and stuff. There's some designs that are just gorgeous and like I wish I could emulate more directly, but I do not want to steal from this man. Um, just because it's impossibly rude. But it is inspiring. Like I've done a bunch of different versions of trying to concept stuff like helmets before, and I still haven't captured like the perfect version of something like this. Like this is of course a professional grade designer doing the kind of solving the kind of problems that I'm talking about. But where's the one with the hands? Because the hands really inspired me to want to take another crack at designing the hands for like the hands and limbs on my sleep character in particular, like trying to come up with new silhouettes and new versions of that. Oh, there we go. There we go. That's the one. Why? I didn't want to drag it to that. So, like, these are all very simple shapes, right? But there's so much variance in like how each of these feels, and so many different bone constructions and stuff that would be going on inside of these sorts of limbs. before finally settling on, like the ones that clearly went into the final design. Um, I don't know. It's driving me to want to do more stuff like this, so that I can lock in certain styles and explore different elements and not just go for the first thing that comes to mind, because that ends up with a lot of stuff looking the same and it rules out a lot of really cool ideas, especially when I'm trying to think of how to create hands for something that can decide what shape its hands actually are. Uh, like where there are and are not bones may mean that in the final design for this sleep character in whatever, like maybe it shapes, maybe it changes shape regularly, and like the bones or tools or whatever is floating around inside of this gelatinous creature, they move around to facilitate that structure or to, push or pull things. Maybe, you know, the fingers end up being like bones protruding like chopsticks instead of actual finger bones sometimes. Or, you know, maybe when it's angry, everything like pushes out and becomes like defensive spikes. Or when it's more subdued, maybe things kind of pull together. Like having a bunch of floating elements inside of this sort of jelly like creature gives me an opportunity to change the structure a lot. But if I do something like this design right here, I've really locked in the skeletal structure, because it's going to be hard to move all of those pieces around. And so I feel like in part something I need to do is a bit more silhouette exploration, kind of getting some different ideas of what it is I want uh, that form to show. Uh, taking a like again, none of these are mine. These are from an artist that I was reminded of today and went and explored his portfolio, and it's inspiring me to work differently. Um, but like just seeing how other people execute things sometimes really helps me understanding the processes. Like this exploration of different headdress designs and shapes, like these completely change the upper silhouette of the character when they have all these different shapes and forms. Uh, Same with this. Like this is a beautiful exploration of different forms and designs for the same sort of character. Like giving a blade or a barb or a stinger or multiple little hooked Barbie stinger things. Like even down to these little mechanisms for the tail. Like this is the kind of stuff that I need to be doing if I'm concepting, a monstrous character. And I feel like I've not been doing enough of it. But I think one of the challenges for me is the three dimensionality of it. And I've been debating whether or not I need to spend more time trying to sculpt. I need to open up Blender between now and the next art stream and like take another crack at sculpting, not just constructing hard surface materials, but actively sculpting something that's a bit more organic. Because I feel like all I've done and all I complain about is how everything is so hard to surface and mechanical and precise and constrained. I've been drawing environments and machines a lot and not these organic shapes, and I feel like I miss that flow. There's a certain simplicity to that, and I feel like hard surface design was like me jumping straight into hard mode. And so maybe there's a chance for me to regain a little bit of the momentum I feel like I regularly lose with burnout on the mechanical, by like getting back to some of these more organic explorations of form and shape and creature design and things like that. And that in turn will, hopefully help inform how I approach the hard surface stuff as well, because if you can sit down and, do a bunch of silhouettes like this, you can do a bunch of silhouettes like this, it's relatively low cost, and you can take and you can mix and match parts from each of these however you like in future designs. Just like he did here, where he took those pieces and came up with, he followed the one silhouette for the most part, but he explored some different head shapes. He explored some different postures and stances and carrying of equipment and like the length and composition of the arms and things. Like there's many different ways in which he's explored this design, and I need to do more of that. I need to do more of that to improve myself and my designs and get closer to being able to create this stuff in a way that I'm happy with. But and I don't know, I feel like there's stuff to do. There's designs to chase. I feel like maybe I need to go back to a more drawing board element, because the more I try and desperately incorporate all of my preconceived notions, the more I'm kind of shackling myself to the old designs and not letting it evolve, you know? And eventually I can evolve backwards, and take some of the old designs and redesign them. Because I'm allowed to do that. They are mine, and I can redo them if I want to. But I don't know. I've talked a bit over my time this evening. I don't know if half of it made sense. I was talking about, you know, world building stuff that's very high concept, low visual, you know, in the beginning. Hopefully that wasn't too boring. And then I wandered off on down character design row and kind of picked at my own designs a little bit and the various problems I've created for myself in doing it. But I haven't done that in a while, and while I've been spending a lot of time sharing, like how I feel about art or how I'm feeling about this, that, and the other, I haven't gone back and applied those thoughts, applied all these different things to my own work as much as I would have liked. And so maybe there's more of a chance to do that now. But in the future, I in the future, which is effectively now, like after I take a break after this stream, I'll have to figure out what I'm going to work on for this evening. I feel like it might be this, although I do have some writing to do that is long overdue. On a deadline that I set, which is kind of funny. Yeah, I'll work on this some more, and we'll see if we can design and expand more into these forms and shapes, and like really break away from that human silhouette that I feel like I keep getting pulled back into. I keep wanting to give it proportional human silhouette in a lot of ways. And whenever I try and dial in the subtlety of the design, I end up drifting back to that. And in the end, I end up with something that feels like, you know, a mermaid or whatever, you know, probably a little bit more like Fiji mermaid style than actual mermaid. But I keep ending back up in that space, and it's not a place that I've liked anytime I've landed there. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing in particular against the sorts of design shapes and like mer creatures and stuff. There's lots of cool stuff there to be had, especially like some of the sea snake sort of designs that I've seen people do. But it's not what I wanted, and I don't know exactly what it is I'm trying to create. Exactly what it is Sleep would decide to be um, between shells. and part of my brain is thinking about like the anatomy of like a hermit crab. Um, because it's very strange, I guess, in its own way. And it's just kind of like mostly an upper body with like a worm like back end that like curls into the shells and stuff that it inhabits. And it's a little bit more octopus like than you might think. All right. Anybody who's not down for arachnids, forgive me, because this is a very spidery looking image. But it's like the head and like the various limbs to like grab and pull and move it around and stuff. And then it's just like this body that, it's dragging around as a shell. And it reminds me a little bit in some ways of like an octopus or something like that, or a squid. And I've been debating about that, about whether or not it's more like that, or if it's more like uh, some form of like jellyfish, because I want there to be some form and some like limbs and things like that. I need limbs and a head for expression, because there is no face. And part of the things that's been going through my head is like finding ways to create expression. Was it uh I don't watch as many VTuber streams as maybe I should to like get an idea of what people are out there doing, just because there's a very specific brand for a lot of that, and I haven't found as many like weird ones that are, here's a skull and a robot. I haven't found that as much. Uh and I'm kind of curious like what other ways people have solved the virtual, you know, virtual representation of self. And I just can't seem to figure out how to find them without being inundated with a lot of the same sort of design philosophies. But I have seen some examples, even in the more traditional VTube rigs and stuff, where expression is not just done through the face, but through other elements of the design coming to life, moving, rearranging, etc. Even if it's only a small amount, like when someone smiles or is happy, like certain parts of their design like flutter around, or you know, there's a glow that comes up or something like that. Like those sorts of things. I feel like there's different ways to create expression and expressiveness in my character without giving them a face, and I want to see if I can do that. Like I managed to give this thing a little bit of expressiveness, um, with just its body language created by the motion of my head. But in the interest of not throwing my neck out, I would like to be able to create a rig that takes things like a smile on my face and interprets that in a way that you can start to recognize it as a smile on a thing that does not have a smile. Like make it, somehow seem happier or sadder or more contemplative based on my facial expressions. Use more of the face tracking, use the eyebrows to do something, use the nose or the mouth to do something, use the smile and the frown to trigger different reactions in a rig. And I think that would be cool, and I haven't done a lot of it with this rig because this is a very simple rig. It doesn't have a lot of, it's got a lot of moving parts, but it does not have a lot of moving parts compared to some of the more complicated rigs out there with like physics and stuff for the hair and all kinds of craziness. I really did Babby's first rig with this thing so that it would be relatively simple. No, no rotation. Just up, down, left, right, and parallax. That's it. But yeah, I would really like to explore designing a more organic rig that can change and move and flow a bit more differently than others. And um, I like the idea of making a rig that has a lot of transformation to it, that is not super static. Like it's not just changing expressions, head moving left or right, but like if I do certain expressions or if I hit certain uh, transformations, maybe the whole rig changes shape. And so it's about creating something that's very flexible like that. Um, Sorry, I know I said I was gonna go, but I just like my brain just started doing a thing. So I'm kind of like imagining like maybe, the way that I do most of the this jelly stuff. I don't know why I'm pointing at my face when you can't see my hand. But the way that I do the plasmoid sort of part of Sleep's character design is there's a background layer, and that's probably about 80 to 90% opaque. So you can see through it just a little bit, just enough to show you that it is transparent. But it also has color and or enough substance to it to block light. And then I'll have layers in an art sense that kind of have a hole punched in them, and it'll be a little fuzzier, and that'll be like it's 60%. And I can put like the skull in there, and and it just means that the areas around it where there's more gel between the foreground and background will be darker. And the areas where this extra layer in the middle, like maybe this is 60% too. Like I forget what my original percentages are, but like all three layers effectively transparent, except for whatever objects are inside, and those may or may not be. Uh, so you might have an object here, you might have an object here, and this one will be much more clear because it only has one layer of transparent stuff at the front, which is, like much clearer. You'll have stuff that's back here, you'll have stuff that's back there. So there's a three dimensionality to the objects behind it. They can move behind one another. I can parallax and move those around. And what's coming through in my brain now is having a design where, I have these outlines, these transparent shapes, which are very simple and don't have a lot of defined form. It's basically just a transparent layer with no outline, just a block of color with some transparency, and then all the objects that are inside, the skull, etc. A bone here, a bone there. Uh, all of these different objects can move a lot more freely. They're not locked into like a rib cage configuration, or like maybe if things get, like if I lean forward, maybe those things kind of come forward and move through the layers to come into more focus, you know um maybe each object has their own transparency layer that I can remask, uh, or whatever, based on the position, so that stuff can come forward in a more three dimensional fashion, pull back in a more three dimensional fashion. Create more of that speed ramping that happens with natural motion. So like when I go to lean forward, stuff moves slowly at first, and then as it gets close to the closest I'm gonna get, it kind of accelerates because it is closer to you and it feels faster. Um, but just like if I have this blob, I can make this blob in the shape of a person. I can change the shape to something more angular. It can have any number of limbs at any given time, and that can change depending on bones and stuff moving around to kind of better allow you to recognize where the skeletons are, where the skeleton is for the moment. And I don't know, I just feel like there's opportunity there that I'm missing because I was locking myself into this tight anatomical sort of model, where my brain wants to solve the problem of how the anatomy would work. And what in actuality is I need less structure, um, and more dynamic movement and shape changing if I want something that's a little bit more freeing and is not just, you know, a paper doll puppet sort of thing. Which, don't get me wrong, that's kind of like how it's going to work regardless. The paper doll puppet element of it, is going to be consistently, part of that problem. But doing so in a little bit more like free and open way, I feel like will be very potentially interesting. The only thing I don't know about is whether or not I can dynamically move the masks over certain transparency layers, which might mean that certain objects have their own sort of transparency layer that moves with them. Uh, Depending on the three dimensionality of the object. I don't know. Having things move and rotate within that space would be even more complicated. Having them like rotate, but still remain on the same like vertical plane, is the easiest way to do that sort of stuff. And I can puppet warp it a little bit to add a perspective trick. Like if I have this object, I can actually with the rig take this object and stretch and skew things to make it look like it's more three-dimensional, but I can only take that so far. If I make the object look too three-dimensional without changing the actual drawing, it will start looking fake. And so that will be the challenge, is creating a bunch of bones and internal structures that I can move around that are relatively resilient against that. So things that, don't immediately have a very clear geometry, um, like a long thin bone or something like that would be easy, but something like, one of these complex shapes here would be incredibly difficult because I would need to redraw it. I would need to create multiple versions from different angles without any sort of three-dimensional reference in order to do it. Now, the other cool thing about this design, then I will shut up and stop for the night, because I'm way over, is if I do something like this little thick boy over here, this weird design of just constantly changing shape, and guiding mood and expression through movement of objects within that space. Um, if I can manage to create something expressive through that, if I did that in 3 dimensions, if I did that with a 3 dimensional model that was full of those type of objects and such, it would be interesting, but also I feel like it would be challenging to rig because I wouldn't have a traditional skeletal structure to follow. And the forms of this outer transparent shell um, would be far more complicated to control. Like they wouldn't have a lot of texture for me to worry about, but they might have some issues unless I do them in a more procedural way, to create that transparency within this outer object, this outer shell, so to speak. But if I did that, I could rotate and move objects within that uh, in very interesting and like real ways without having to redraw them because they would be a 3 dimensional object. It would just be about rotating or moving it within the space and creating like key shapes that it could go to and like tween between the different like locations of motion and then have that be the new position for the rig. Um, I feel like there's a lot of potential there for like a really wild ass rig, but it's also like incredibly complicated and probably a big reach for someone who has not rigged a 3D model yet. So I don't know. I got dreams. I got big dreams as usual. Eyes are bigger than my stomach, so to speak. But I do like the idea of creating something that is far more malleable in live 2D by having it be simply like transparent layers that I can warp and change the shape of relatively easily without having to worry about changing the textures within them. And then I can just have like highlights and things like that on a separate layer above that so that I can move those pieces around without without them being directly warped by changing the skin, so to speak, of this gelatinous figure. But I might need to look some stuff up on that and see where I'm at because there's some texturing and things that I can do. But more layers there are to it, the more it's gonna be of a headache to rig to move together. So I gotta keep that in mind, I guess. But before I do that, I gotta do a whole bunch of concepting drawings and like do some varied shapes and things like that and figure out what it is I'm looking for, what pieces of various sea life I want to invoke, what sort of forms I want to mimic, and what stuff I want to leave behind, as opposed to being a slave to my old designs. I don't know. We'll see. Well, before another ad break kicks in, uh, that's been my meandering design decision process, world building, whatever the hell. A little bit of chaos, but it was mostly about fictional stuff and not about my own problems and relationships to art. I don't know. Maybe that's a welcome change. I know it's a bit of a welcome change for me. It's nice to actually work on solving a concept and design problem as opposed to the real world problems of generating motivation and you know keeping everything going in a world that feels like it's kind of rough for artists right now. Trying to be creative, even when sometimes it takes a lot of energy to do so, and you just don't have it. But it's been nice. It's been a little reinvigorating to look at some of this stuff in a more direct way again, and hopefully we'll get back to a little bit more of it later in the week. Wednesday, I've quiet stream, which I'm still debating changing the format on to be a little bit more talky, but I don't know. Uh, it's feeling more and more weird to just kind of sit there and work on artwork and like have people come in or out of chat, like, and try and get a response from me and then immediately bail because I'm not talking. I don't know. I don't know how many people lurk for those streams, but I will be back for that and co-op gaming and stuff on Friday. But that's all I've got for this evening. And go out there and do some art. Don't be afraid to take apart some old designs and chuck them out the window and or salvage as many parts of them as you'd like to create something new. Just because it didn't work out the way you wanted the first time doesn't mean it's totally crap worth burning. But don't be stuck with it either. I don't even know what piece of advice I just gave. Anyways, I'm tired. I'll catch everybody later. Have a good night. Have a good week. Goodbye. So long, farewell. Other words.